This is not a tale of heroism telling of a battle against a great evil that united the galaxy to the threats that closed in around it like the jaws of a starving beast. This is not a song of remembrance that will ring out forever across the void for our fallen saviors. This is not glorification of the statues scattered across worlds without count that depict our heroes in their greatest moment of truly noble conflict. This is an obituary written by the shattered survivors of a terrible war, mourning the loss of a great friend. 200 years ago, we heard the first transmissions of a friend lying in wait in their home system, eagerly calling out to us with the hopes of peaceful coexistence. We chased after their cries, listening as the hope drained from their voice as our ships traversed the vastness between us at speeds that would make light weep in misery. We arrived just in time to watch as they tore at their own throats in a global war that would have led to their extinction had we not intervened. 1 billion survived the atomic fire of the Earth's funeral pyre. 1 billion lives were held in the cramped confines of an overburdened carrier en route to the nearest port. 1 billion survivors of the second worst tragedy of the galactic empire. If only we knew at the time that those shell-shocked victims of their own people's wrath would one day become legends. Humanity arrived in the care of their nearest neighbors, the feisty Rakanaz, and were quick to adapt to their new status as interplanetary refugees. Snippets of their culture and society seeped into the cracks of their semi-avian/aquatic caretakers, leading the system as a whole to undergo a cultural evolution. Tensions between people lessened, and xenopolitics became increasingly relaxed as the planetary hosts rapidly grew to be less pessimistic towards their visiting ambassadors. It seemed as though the predatory nature of their race was given new outlets, such as competitive sports and competitions of physical prowess, and their appreciation for the art and music of other people was heightened. It was no wonder that the diplomatic relations of the nearest species became almost brotherly in just a few short years. Humans outbound on ships headed for different worlds had a similar effect, like a chain reaction jumping from one habitable system to the next. The Waluk, Pochimes, and Yathwans were the next to be elevated by the inclusion of these homeless curiosities. New religions, expanded social norms, even emergent technology followed in the wake of these naked bipeds. It was distressing to those who lived on the opposite side of the Milky Way, but those closest to ground zero were somewhat expectant of the arrival of humans of their own, after hearing how things changed for those already hosting them. By 50 years and 2 generations of humans later, there had already been a massive shift in the undercurrents of society as humans made their way to every corner of civilized space. By the time that the upper governments noticed the way things were changing, they could no longer stop it, nor were they pressed to. Humans had already begun to step into the middle stratum of society, and the benefits were shared across the stars. The innate curiosity and energetic mind of the humans was their secret weapon in their fluid assimilation into the galaxy, but it was also their greatest trait as their inclusion began to change the very world around them. By the 90th year of the loss of Earth, the human population had exploded to match the numbers lost in the nuclear blast that had sent them flying across the universe. The initial survivors were short-lived compared to their children, but through them, we still were able to hear of the splendor of the Terran homeland until the last of their kind had ceased to be. 100 years after their arrival, the first human world leader had risen to power and begun to make changes to the political structure that kept order in the cosmos. Perhaps losing their homeworld taught them something that nobody else could ever comprehend, but the push for environmental preservation and removal of overly destructive weapons was a constant of these newly appointed leaders. Even on worlds that were adamantly against the social inclusion of humans, there was a pressure that would erode even the most seasoned of office holders to being more amicable to their pleas. Longevity and harmony began to seem less like an optimist dream and more of a reality that could someday be reached. Oh, but there were always issues that would prevent that. Not every human was a golden-hearted being of kindness and mercy, and those who had a xenophobic stance aimed towards humanity would seize every misdeed performed by a Terran as a supposed secret motive that every human held. Corrupt humans in the political scene were also present, but even amid those of similar character, they would stand out by dwarfing their greed as the worst offender by far. The presence of humans serving as mercenaries and/or privateers did little help to the reputation of the species. Then began the peacekeeping wars, a 30-year battle between order and chaos instigated by various separatist factions that sought to undermine civilization. Humanity, like every other race, had people on both sides of the conflict. Many lives were lost, many good people were wrongly incarcerated, and families were torn apart once more. Fortunately for the people of this era, these skirmishes were nothing compared to the great galactic civil war of centuries past, and the older and wiser community was able to mitigate the bloodshed. Many of the scholars of today look back on those battles and agree that the participation of humans might have been the reason that Tractions was so hard to gain by the Separatists, as sending an endangered species to fight its own kind was much too harsh of a burden for some rebels. Regardless of the shortcomings of those of poor reputations and the mistakes of fools, those who strove to improve the lives of those around them shone bright enough to scour away much of the filth tossed upon the name of humanity. Life went on, the people changed, and the everyday life of the galaxy went on as normal for a blissfully uneventful 20 additional years. These days were the times that our war-torn veterans and rugged laborers would refer to as the good old days over drinks at pubs and bars across the galaxy. Indeed, these 2 decades were too short a time for humanity to finally have peace. The arrival of an enemy from beyond the galactic reaches was the death knell of peace in our time. There was no name declared upon their arrival, no banners or markings upon their black ships, just the glow of weaponized plasma guns and the flames of burning worlds. We called them the Scourge due to their malicious ways of exterminating anything before them, but even that name didn't encompass the sheer ruthlessness of this enemy. Trillions dead across a dozen worlds within the first day of their arrival meant that there would be no peace with these invaders. Thus began the worst conflict our galaxy had ever faced. The Scourge was something of a nightmare born from the twisted desires of a dead race, a super machine that could improve itself to kill using the most efficient method possible. We did not even need to question if these abominations of metal and synthetic organic computers had turned on their masters, as every vessel we successfully disabled held data that showed their home galaxy as a barren wasteland of planet-sized foundries, churning out an unending tide of weapons. There was no higher intelligence behind the lenses of these slaughter-driven mechanoids, only the algorithmic purpose of ending life like a virus. This was a threat that would unify every sentient species of our galaxy to the common goal of survival. So it was that the great engines of war revved to life with a true passion. Entire lunar bodies were converted to shipyards, asteroid belts broken open for their precious ores, and barren worlds turned to barracks or defense points to hold back the soulless machine's advance. Our efforts were not in vain, but there was no doubt that this war was no test of wit or cunning, but a measure of endurance. A silent question was asked by everyone as the years of conflict dragged on: who would crumble first, flesh or metal? At first it seemed that it might have been the organics, but our hopes were burned to ash when the true fleets arrived. Every ship we had disabled or destroyed belonged to the first probing attack sent by the Scourge, which meant that our blood and sorrow meant little when compared to the impending doom that was traveling towards us while we buried our dead. In an instant, there was a scream heard across 1,000 systems as the true might of the scourge unveiled itself in a tidal wave of guns and carnage. Our losses were terrible, but the calculations of our strategists had predicted such a threat and had already conducted evacuations on the majority of the population. None were surprised that the first to arrive on board evacuation shuttles were human medics and first responders carrying on the legacy of their people alongside others as equals. The only saving grace granted to us by the machines was an oversight in their programming that forced them to wait for new orders after destroying their targets. The losses we incurred only enraged us as we threw every drop of plasma and usable bullet at their newest fleet, our fury blinding us as our fleets ripped themselves apart in order to ensure that the unfeeling offenders would never forget their mistake. As our great fleets ripped the ranks of the scourge apart in the ruins of empires, the humans began to scheme behind our backs. A plan was hatched by their scientists, and a secret vote was passed by their holders of authority. The very next day, the galactic leaders were offered a plan to end the war before our losses became too great, but they read the plan over and scoffed at the insanity of it. The Pickens-Jenkins plan was a proposed suicide mission to carry a weapon that would disable the scourge at their heart into their territory, but to the leaders of that time it seemed much too foolish to even contemplate. Their plan rejected, humanity as a whole began to amass the means of fulfilling the required naval power and weaponry in order to enact the plan against the wishes of their leaders. Across the remaining territories of the galaxy, there were reports of human civilians and soldiers alike hijacking vessels and shipments of munitions and heading for the burnt husk of Earth. These reports were not deemed important at the time due to the impending third wave of the scourge that was on approach, and it is only today that we can look back and regret ignoring them. It was true that they had amassed a stockpile of weapons and a triple-sized fleet of every kind of vessel, but there was one object in their arsenal that should have been looked for the instant it had vanished. The reality bomb was this item, a galaxy-killing weapon that had been developed by a madman and locked away due to the fact that it was impossible to dismantle it that had been thought lost during the opening days of the war. Then it came, the third wave of the scourge. Unlike before, these ships formed a single wall and began to scrape every trace of life from the planets in their way at sublight speed. This was not a calculated strike. This was a genuine effort to remove a threat that our society was able to pose. All we could do was amass our fleets in the core systems of the galaxy and pray that our last bastion would hold out against this guillotine strike aimed at our necks. That is, until we heard the broadcast. Humanity as a whole had come together to form the last human fleet and were about to embark on the great sacrifice that would save us all. We begged them to bring their ships to join us and weather this storm as our brethren, but their somber reply sent a chill through the heart of every being that heard it. There is no hope in that plan. We might live through today, but when the next wave comes, we will have nothing left to hold them back again. And then what? This galaxy will become another den for the scourge, from which it will travel to the next system in order to complete its objective. They will not fare any better than we did, and in time, they too will fall to this unending tide of destruction. All life in this universe is in danger of this threat, and it is up to us to cut it off before it grows any further. We are humanity. We shall be the sword that cuts off the serpent's head, the shield that protects this universe, and the sacrifice that will bring back the flames of hope. This is our burden, our duty, and our promise. You've all been kind to us ever since the day we burned our home and lost our way. You showed us that this universe can be kind and caring even in the worst of times. We lost everything and gained so much more than we ever dreamed, so we made it our mission to pay our debt back in full. This final act is us evening the score once and for all. We go now into the dark so that you all may take that which we leave behind and build a better future. Do not mourn us, for we chose this end willingly for our friends and families across the galaxy. We can only ask that you remember us when we're gone and learn from our mistakes. This is Terra, signing off one last time. Spes et libertas, lux in tenebris. With the final transmission sent and their warp drives primed, the last strike force of the human race struck out at the very core of the Scourge galaxy. The encroaching wave ground to a halt as their machine mind calculated the trajectory of the humans. Then, as if fear had risen from within the code of the machines, they all turned to give chase to these crazy bipeds. Every eye was peeled and looking to the stars or the televisions that displayed live feeds from outer system satellite footage of their magnificent end. Humanity, wounded and bloody as she was about to save us all. The final battle for all life had begun, and we survivors could only watch as it all unfurled from afar. The fleet pierced through the first defensive formation set before them by sending the largest cargo ships packed with nuclear warheads into the fray and detonating them in order to tunnel through the swarms of drones and automated vessels. When they had run out of the nukes, they instead resorted to enormous carriers that were packed to the point of bursting with self-guiding rockets and missiles of every payload imaginable. The carriers would set off hull-breaching charges on themselves in order to open their hulls wide enough for every missile to clear the frame, then would pirouette into the void as trillions of streaks shot from their skeletal form in order to chase after and destroy the nearest vessels. Railguns on human destroyers melted themselves into slag as rounds were fired wildly. Torpedoes shot off in every direction, leaving great swaths of wreckage lingering behind them, and compressed plasma beams lit up the jet-black hulls of every enemy that dared approach the formation. At first it looked as though the mission would be a perfect success, but the Scourge would not allow them to take one more step. Dreadnoughts of every class suddenly appeared and made a wall between the humans and the final stretch of their journey. With no choice but to try and fight their way through, the human fleet formed a dense ball and began to fire in every direction indiscriminately. One by one their ships were destroyed, until only the strongest or most hardy vessels were left operational. The Scourge pulled back for a moment as the final blow was about to be delivered, but the humans had one last strategy to employ. Warp signatures rippled the fabric of space and time as every ship but the one carrying the bomb went into overdrive and threw themselves at the wall of dreadnoughts and the approaching swarm. Detonations that shone like miniature supernovas engulfed the entire battlefield, leaving nothing there from what anyone could tell. All hope seemed to be lost since the reality bomb had not been detonated. That was until a single warp signature appeared near the center of the enemy galaxy. The only true human dreadnought, the carrier of the Great Bomb, had managed to fire their own warp drive at the moment that the others had gone critical, and was able to squeeze between the exploding allies and enemy ships in order to arrive where it had. One additional transmission was recorded and sent out, but by the time it arrived, we had already seen the aftermath. The last vestige of humanity's wrath was parked at the center of enemy territory, her hull torn to shreds and the guns lining her sides all reduced to burning craters. Her ivory-white paint was completely gone, leaving only blackened metal and bare titanium, and the magnificent form of the dagger-shaped ship was now more like a twisted knife that had been cracked and bent. Despite her crude appearance, she stood alone and defiant as the singularity housed within her core began to send vibrations across the fabric of reality. Even as time itself began to fold in on itself, she stood there defiant and proud until all light became engulfed by the event horizon of the unstable black hole. In an instant, the war was won. The galaxy that the Scourge had come from was swept away as the blast wave tore the mechanical menace into atoms, leaving nothing but space dust and memories. There was no celebration of victory or feasts to our fallen. Instead, there was a silence of reverence and respect as we waited for the last words of humanity to reach us. 3 days passed before the signal made it to us, and on the fourth, there was nothing but tears in the eyes of the people. Take care of each other. That was it, the final wish of the human race. Even after losing everything and having to carve a new life out of the handouts of others, they still only wanted peace. It is a truly sad sentiment, but one that would never be forgotten. 200 years was all the time we had been given to share with humanity. There are still a few living humans still in the galaxy, but the chances of ever seeing them brought back to their former greatness is nearly impossible. Even if it happened, it would not be the same humanity that we had lost. This is an obituary after all, so it must be written with certainty that the spirit of the people of Earth is gone. Alas, things in the universe are not as bleak as they once were. Following their parting wishes, the governments of the surviving races have all come together under the unified banner of peace and have sworn to forever uphold the ideology of their lost brothers and sisters. Statues were erected, songs were written, history books were published, and monuments prayed to across the galaxy in remembrance of our heroes. The word humanity was elevated to a title of reverence, almost like the mentioning of a holy figure's name. They may be gone, but their influence will never fade from the hearts they had touched. We owe our lives to the heroic sacrifice of the Terrans, and it is our moral duty to uphold the tenets they hope to imprint upon us. We can only hope that they look upon us from the afterlife and smile on us kindly, watching us cherish their memory and mourn their passing. They might be lost to us forever, but the lasting warmth they left in our hearts will always remain. Excerpt from Hope and Freedom, A Light in the Dark. The Earth Story.